would have waited an eternity for this. It's over, Prime.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. We're back again talking transformations. With me, I have Andrew Leff.
Hey.
And I have Troy Lightfoot.
Hello.
And the topic of this evening is integral theory and integral transformations. So we did cover this topic. Troy covered this topic with William Schreidem. Shout out to William. Brilliant guy. Probably about a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And there's no guarantee that some of you listeners were around at that point. So what we wanted to do is go back through this topic and apply it specifically to what we're seeing in the transformation space and how some of these theories and some of the concepts explained in this book can actually be beneficially used for us practitioners when it comes to getting a change unstuck, getting to a transformation where we kind of feel like things are out of sorts and you kind of don't understand why. This lends us another tool and another lens to look at transformations and see maybe where we can get things going back in the right direction. So Troy, I'm going to kick it over to you, and I'm going to say, for the benefit of the listeners who may not have been here for the first show, may not remember that interview with William, can you give us a little bit of a background on integral theory itself?
All right. So integral theory, another term for that is the theory of everything. It was created by a gentleman named Ken Wilber, who's a philosopher. He's written many books on science, politics, religion, and he locked himself in his house for 3 years in the early 90s or mid 90s, I think, and wrote this book. And he literally didn't leave his house for 3 years to write this book. And he studied pretty much every major religion, political system in the world, and tried to decide were there commonalities across everything, across all human knowledge, that drove for the best decision making. And he created this model, and it's called integral theory, and it is literally a meta theory of everything of human knowledge. Now, it sounds a little wild. I understand that, and I'm not going to deny that it sounds crazy, but I will tell you that it works because I've used it personally, and I've seen other people use it, and you can use it for anything from one little decision in your life you're trying to make to all the way up to transformational scales, all the way up to politics and, something like, we talked about spiral dynamics, which was used with Nelson Mandela in South Africa for apartheid. So it could be used at something at that scale too. So quick example. I mean, I used this when I was desperately for many years trying to lose weight, and I applied this model to some decision making, and it really helped me lose a lot of weight and helped me. It wasn't the one thing that helped me, but it helped me formulate the things I had to do to be able to accomplish my goal of the weight loss. Right.
And,
yeah, go ahead.
And I think when we get to that, Troy, we'll start talking about the typical 4-box. But one of the concepts I think that's vital to understanding integral theory is the concept of a holon, right? And Ken Wilber introduces that early. And for listeners, a holon means a whole part. So if you think about it, everything is a whole, but it's also part of something else. For an example, if you look at your arm can be considered a self-contained thing. It is your arm. It is also a part of your body, which is a part of a society, which is part of a planet, which is part of a galaxy, blah, 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 blah. Your arm includes your hand, which includes fingers, which includes knuckles, which includes cells, going all the way down to that quantum foam Planck level. So I thought that was another interesting way when especially in the book, when he talks about religion and how religion, that whole nesting theory, everything is its own self-contained piece, but it is also part of a larger whole, and it could also be broken down even smaller. So I think that's a big concept, especially when we get to the transformation part of this discussion, thinking about things in that realm.
Yes. So when we describe the 4 quadrants, maybe we'll do that next. The kind of thing that works about this, in my opinion, is that we all have our own biases and we all have our own subjective truth of what we think is true about the world. And there are obviously objective truths about the world, but a lot of times when we make decisions, it's very hard for us to even make that decision, what is totally objectively true, as well as what might be objectively true might not get the result we want. So what I mean is, it could be objectively true if you're going through a natural transformation that something exists right now, or there's a reason why things are happening. But that doesn't actually tell you how to get to an end result or a goal. So this model actually takes different, it's almost like, it's kind of a weird way of saying this, but it's almost like it doesn't matter what the one objective truth is. It's really identifying what are the different parts of truth that we can look at from different perspectives and figure out how to make the best decisions. So maybe we can go into the 4 quadrants.
Yeah.
If you like. Okay.
Yeah, I would say let's go with the 4. And Troy, you take the first one, the upper left hand.
Okay, so it depends on what scale you're looking at for these quadrants. So we'll take something like, I'll use a very simple example to try to be relatable, right? So obviously I talked about my weight loss journey and I've mentioned that a few times on this podcast, and it's not just weight loss, but it's really just regaining my health period. So I had tried that many times and I had the willpower to do that many times, but I always ended up failing for one reason or another. So the top left quadrant. So if you look at like any good model, it's 4 quadrants. So that's a joke, but okay. So model, it's 4 quadrants. Okay. So and if you look at the left side, okay, if you're looking at the model like on a piece of paper, if you look at the left side, that is things that are on the interior, and if you look at the right side, that's things that are on the exterior. If you look at the top of the model, that is things that are on the individual side, and if you look at the bottom, that is things on the collective side. So I'll give you an example. The top left quadrant is interior individual. Okay, so if you're talking about a person, what lives there are things like their thoughts, their motivations, their feelings, their willpower, their knowledge. All these things live that you can't externally see these things. And you can't really externally measure them per se, but they are there and they are just as important as external things you can measure. In fact, they could be more important depending on what the topic is, right? So because of that, I had the willpower, which existed in that top left quadrant, but I didn't have some of the things in the other quadrants. So Jay, if you'd like to talk about the next quadrant, we can go into it.
Sure. So what I will do is I will go into the upper right quadrant. So
Okay.
Where you said upper left, that is, like you said, that is the interior, what could also be considered the subjective, right? It is the self. When I was reading this, the thing that kept bouncing around in my head is every quadrant backs up to some sort of philosopher, right? So the upper left this is Jung, this is Sigmund Freud, this is Buddha, this is Aurobindo, this is all about the internal self, right? So let's go the other way. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the individual, objectively defined, right? So this is the right-hand side, this is the individual objective, this is behavior, right? So science is in your upper right-hand corner. This is John Watson, John Locke, empiricism, behaviorism. The reference that always falls in my head, B.F. Skinner and the Skinner box, right? So this is viewing the individual externally. So this is, whereas the first example was Troy looking at himself, the second example would be me looking at Troy. So it could be the it's quadrant where I'm making an observation based upon what I'm seeing Troy do. It's all about behavior.
Right. So in my example for the kind of health transformation, that quadrant would be things like my weight, my body fat, what I'm eating, exercise, metrics I could track that are objectively true that anyone could see, right? Clothing, you name it. So those are things related to me as a person that are objectively true that can be measured and seen by people on the outside. So that lives in that quadrant. I'll go with the bottom left quadrant. So the bottom left quadrant is interior collective, which are things like, top left quadrant is interior self. So the bottom left quadrant is interior collective. And what that means is it's also things that are more subjective, things that are less tangible, but things that are more than one person. So for an example, interior collective is, you might hear this term as like culture, for example. What's the culture of your marriage? What's the culture of a company? What's the culture of the town you live in versus the state versus the country, right? And those things which are much more difficult are not so observable from the outside or measurable, but are true. So for example, your relationships with the people in your family, in your life, the actual relationships themselves are part of that interior but collective, right? And those are just as important as anything else, because if you think about it, in my example, it wasn't until I really sat down with my wife and explained what I was trying to accomplish and how I did that top right corner. I explained that to her, all that like measurable stuff that I'm going to try to do and the food I'm going to try to eat, because I had tried these things before and it didn't work. And this time it was really about establishing the relational things with my wife to help get that cultural support in our marriage, basically. Knowing that when I'm struggling, or she can help me with certain things food wise, or whatever the case is, that basically was really an alignment between her and I on this thing I was trying to accomplish. Once I sat down with her, that was the last kicker for it to work, I think. Because once I had that top right corner, once I had what I was going to eat, how I was going to behave, what I was going to measure, I already had the willpower. And then it was like that when we get to the bottom right corner, I'll just go into it, Jay, so I can finish it off.
Sure.
So the bottom right corner are exterior collective things. So those are things that are measurable and observable from the outside, but that are more a part of a collective. So for me, it was things like doctors, restaurants, work, things at work, for example, food at work, or gyms, or whatever the case is, right? So these are things that are part of now it's just beyond me. It's things I have to consider that are part of a system, right? Because when you walk into a grocery store, that is part of a larger system. Because if you think about it, the things that are in that grocery store are approved by a bigger system, which is a governmental system. And then the amount of types of food that are in that grocery store, or the percentages, are also usually either dictated by a governmental system of food recommendations, or by a capitalistic system of what is selling and what are the people like to buy, right? So you have to understand those systems and think about that to be able to get to the goal, which was a health transformation. Right. So you could see how putting all four quadrants together enabled me to be successful, because I had the willpower, I had the knowledge, I had the things to measure and what to do as far as objectable things. I sat down with a friend of mine who's been doing this way of eating for a long time. And he sat down and taught me that whole right side, individual, exterior, self and system, what to consider and what to do and these things. And then me and my wife, we got together and kind of wrapped up that corner. So that's an example of how you use the decision. You can use the framework, because everything is a part. Like every quadrant is a whole on its own, and it's also a part of all the other quadrants. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Now that makes sense. And just to give a little bit more background, when Troy was talking about the individual, the collective, the culture, right, which is the collective subjective. Again, going back to philosophy, this is Heidegger, this is Gadamer. Bottom right-hand corner, where Troy was talking about the system, right? So this is an externally viewable collective. This is a system. This is a construct. What was the other word? Collective. This is things like systems theory. I know he's the preferred political philosopher du jour, but Karl Marx, socialism and communism. This is the collective whole. Seize the means of reproduction, all that sort of stuff. So, Troy, you just gave a good example of using all four quadrants to do your weight loss transformation. Mm-hmm. The other example I find that is really helpful when you think about these things is, as much as it's a hot button topic, it's something that everybody can easily relate to, and it's politics. So the best example I can think of is you turn on the television and the story in the news is gun violence in southern Chicago, right? Mm-hmm. Very, very large amounts of gun violence. Southern Chicago is predominantly an African-American area, right? What happens? What's the narrative that you hear depending upon the channel you turn on? Well, if you turn on Fox News, they're going to say, well, it's problems with the people, and they need to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and their culture is bad, and they need to get back to traditional American values, right? Completely ignoring the systemic problems that created the poverty, that created that situation in the first place. That same argument, if you watch MSNBC or you watch CNN, they're going to say, oh, these poor people, it's the system, and the system's got them down, and their behaviors are learned. Not mentioning that there is some part of it that has to do with culture, and there is some part of it that has to do with personal responsibility. So, and I'm not blaming or pointing fingers. All I'm saying is that it helps elucidate that example helps illuminate the point that all these pieces are connected. They're all very important. There is no simple cause for problems. It's typically a schism between some of the quadrants.
And I'll add on to that, Jay, because that was a great example. That one of the problems that leadership tends to have. So we'll talk about politics, but you might be able to relate to this to your work life as well, right? Is what we in integral theory they call it reductionism. So when people see the world through only their truth or only their quadrant, which they tend to look through, then they reduce decision making to that specific quadrant, which doesn't address which isn't the best way of solving a problem without looking at the whole and the parts, right? All four quadrants. So give an example. I mean, the political thing, right? So conservatives tend to reduce things to the top left corner, which is personal responsibility.
Yeah, Troy, you need to own it. You need to fix it.
Right.
You need to make it better. Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is they're right. But liberals tend to focus on the bottom right quadrant, which is everything can be fixed by a system, right? And what's interesting about that is they're also right. So they're both right. It's just a matter of they're only looking at it through one lens, right? So another example is if someone's poor, how do we solve that problem? Is it just the fact that they're lazy? No. Right? Okay. Is it the fact that they have a lack of motivation? Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. That could be part of it. But why do they have a lack of motivation? Was it a cultural thing? Was it the environment they grew up in? Right? Is it simply that their personal, the way they feel about themselves is not good, right? It could be many, many reasons. The point is that you can't reduce to only one quadrant. So always looking at it, a problem or a situation from all four quadrants can help solve a problem. And if you see the problem we're in our current state, at least in the US, where you have people reducing things to only one quadrant and then sticking their foot in the ground and saying, this is how to run things, you'll never going to get resolution, or you're never going to be able to solve problems that way. And things are getting worse and worse. So, and in fact, this is a little bit of a rant, I understand, but when you do have people that are looking through multiple lenses, then one side calls them some name, and the other side calls them some name. And if you have both sides calling people a name, that means they're probably doing the right thing. That's my opinion. So anyway, so
let's swing this around, and now that we've given more of the background, I think Lef is taking notes furiously. I want to start with Andrew, and I want to talk about this particular idea, the idea of the collective, the individual, the culture, the system, how it all ties together, behavior with transformations. And Lef, we were talking before we started recording, where you actually were talking about, you think you'd come across some of this stuff inadvertently without actually knowing it. And you've used some of this idea without knowing that you're using this idea. Can you give us a little bit more? I want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and geez, you guys just completely blew my mind. I was like sitting here thinking, wow, I don't know if I'm smart enough to be on this podcast tonight. But with that being said, it's interesting to me, this stuff, and some of the one of the certifications that I've been working towards deals with this in a little bit of a different way, but I see how it can correlate. And talking about, in the theme and spirit of transformation, it's important. And Troy, you always phrase things better than I do, but in the sense of you can't just look at one piece of the quadrant, right? Like one side, one quarter. You really have to look at the holistic approach and align your goals to where you want to, or how do you heat map out, or how do you, create a radar to show if you're moving in a certain direction, if you really want to start looking at measurements. But I think from a transformation perspective, like when I look at systems, people are part of systems, right? Or you have many systems of people, and then you have nested systems within those systems of people. So how do you start to utilize this? I don't know, maybe I'm too simple-minded to think outside of this box, but this almost is like, how do you deduct sort of decisioning through your brain and think of making decisions using this sort of technique?
Okay, well, go ahead, Jay.
No, you go first. I'll step on whatever you answer.
Well, I think it depends on what level you're looking at, because you can use this at any level. Like, for example, you can go to an organization and use this model at a very meta level for the organization. Or you can go to one Agile team and use the model. So for example, I created a retro based off of integral theory. It's on our coalition. Maybe we can link it in the show notes.
Yep, I'll put it in the show notes.
And you can see how you can use this for like a team retro for improvement. That's one thing. Another thing is if you're a coach or a scrum master, you can use integral theory to devise a set of metrics in all 4 quadrants. And you can scale that to program, portfolio, really to the whole company. So because in order to make a change, in order to get from point A to point B, we don't want to reduce things to only one quadrant. We want to consider all 4 quadrants all the time. So because it really takes all 4 quadrants to get the results we want. So for example, things in that top right quadrant, we'll start there. That's the easiest one, I think, for a team. Those are one team. So when I say individual, in this case, I'm talking about a team being an individual, okay? So we're not looking at one person now, we're looking at a team as an entity as a whole. That if you say, what's objective, what should we measure that's objective for a team? Well, you can measure quality. You can measure things like flow metrics. Those are some examples, right? And okay, so we'll start there. How about the bottom right quadrant? Well, we can measure systemic things that are that could be impacting that team, right? So for example, is that team working on a lot of escape defects? Is that team having a lot of environmental issues? How stable are the environments? What is the mean time to someone in leadership resolving a problem for them? You can measure things like that if you want. You could do maybe more systemic measurements related to DevOps and operations, right? It's related to that team. So that would live in that. So that's now we're forming the right side of the model of what metrics to determine for a team. On the left side, you have things like team culture. And those are things that are much more difficult to measure, of course, but there's ways you can do it. And one of them could be through surveys, assessments, so things like ENPS, which is like employee net promoter. There's many, many ways to do it. And you can measure it there, as well as team knowledge, team skills, team motivation, these types of things. And then the top left quadrant are the individuals on the team and what are the intangible things about them? What are their knowledge, skill sets, motivations? Can we find out what motivates each team member and help drive that, bring that out? You know, what gives them workplace satisfaction? How are they feeling about the team they're on and those types of things? And whether that's through assessments, whether that's through conversations and retros, however we can track that type of thing. Now you're taking all 4 quadrants and thinking about how a team can improve from the individual on the team, from the team, it's the culture of the team, from things that we can measure that's in the team's control and things that we can measure that's out of the team's control, because all 4 things are going to drive the improvement or not improvement, right? So that is how you might use integral theory for a team.
Shit, I didn't even think about metrics. Troy's always 2 steps ahead of me. When I think of this, right, and I'll give an example that we're currently working on at my current job. We're in the process of trying to develop a flow state at the portfolio level. So we are admittedly a safe shop, and we are trying to develop that flow of epics through the system, consistently delivering value. And when we go through these decomposition sessions where we're trying to figure out, well, what's the next steps for us to enable that type of environment? We even had one earlier today, and I had this picture, this grid in my mind where I kept thinking, okay, is the problem the people, right? Do we have the people that aren't of the right mind? Are they bought in? And as the conversation went on, well, no, 90% of the people were bought in. There was a small percentage that didn't really understand where they fit, so there's an opportunity for improvement there. But then then I thought, okay, well, if there's a small percentage of people that need to be, brought on board with how their role changes as like an epic owner, well, then what does that do to behavior? Are we modeling the right behaviors? Are we rewarding the right behaviors? Are we incentivizing people not having 400 epics all in progress? Are we looking at entry and exit criteria? So that was a conversation. Then the next conversation became around the culture. Well, if we have all these people who are bought in, are they pushing uphill against the culture? It's like trying to swim against the tide. Is there an overriding sense from leadership that they're not bought in, right? Because that's, when you say leadership, that transitions from the I to the we, because that's way more amorphous and ill-defined, but it's also a collective, right? A collective interior. So the question then becomes, okay, so what is our culture doing? Like, what is the general zeitgeist? And then, of course, that leads into, well, do we have the right system in place? Do we have the right processes? When are our portfolio epic refinements? When are our backlog refinements and prioritization decomposition sessions? That's a perfect example, for me at least. That's my most recent example of using this grid in my mind when we're trying to solve for a problem in our transformation, where we're sort of stuck trying to figure out where the shortcoming is.
Okay. So I think I have something I can add on to that one, Jay, if you don't mind.
Shoot.
Can you hear me? Everything good?
Yeah.
Okay. So I gave an example of how you might use it with an Agile team, right? So here's an example of a way you can scale this, a real world example. So I was working with a product team at a company. When I say product team, I mean product managers, all the POs that are part of that product team, as well as the VP and SVP of product. So it's its own kind of, now all the POs were on Agile teams, of course, but I'm saying this is the product team, right? Does that make sense? So their SVP is kind of measured on obviously the performance of the product team, as well as things like retention or attrition or workplace satisfaction, these types of things from HR, right? So this product team was using something called a Hoshin Kanri. I don't know if anyone would have heard of that. A Hoshin Kanri matrix for OKRs. So we use this Hoshin Kanri there, and basically what it does is it ties company initiatives and strategic objectives 3 to 5 years, down to 1 year, down to quarterly, down to individuals on the team, and you can see a pattern and how they all link. Okay, and all of these things were things that lived in the right side of integral theory, right? So they're all things that are external, objectively measured, basically. So it might be something as simple as, has the product team gotten features ready, 99% or whatever the metric is before PI planning or something like that, right? Could be something as simple as that to actual product metrics. Could be many things. So all that's great, and that was going well, and we're tracking all that, and we're moving towards it. But meanwhile, some folks on the product team were reporting in some kind of HR surveys a workplace dissatisfaction, right? Or that they weren't happy. And for there could be for many reasons. So what I did was I worked with that SVP, and I facilitated a workshop with all of the product team about trying to drive out what the real root causes of the problems were, using integral theory as an actual facilitation framework for that. So I have that workshop I created, and I got to be honest with you, it was like we came out with so many things that were actionable for that SVP to go implement, because they were all 99% of them were systemic issues. They weren't even with that SVP. They weren't even problems with the SVP. So it's like on his report card, it might have looked bad in one example because he's got people that are unhappy. But it turned out when we did this root cause using integral theory as a group, and I facilitated it, that the problems were very systemic, and they actually mostly weren't related to that leader. So that leader then actually funny enough, out of that session, we created a bunch of 5 different hypotheses that if the leadership did these things, we believe that we would get these results for us as the product team, right? Either workplace satisfaction or some career growth or whatever the case is. So he would go prioritize them and implement them. And then we would go test out whether that was moving the needle on the metrics. And that was an example of doing things like that top left and bottom left corner. That was the missing piece for the product team, because we already had this Hoshin Kanri matrix, which is all objective, things we can measure, right? So that's a real life example. And then you could scale this up if you want to do this with a leadership team. If you walk in and you're saying, hey, let's use this model for leadership itself, and and how the company behaves and how the leadership behaves. So that's some examples of how you can use the model.
So my next question, I'm gonna start with Lef because again, he's fairly new to this thing. I think Troy, we totally went down the nerd rabbit hole here. Lef, I know you've been through more transformations from different places. You've seen a lot of different companies, probably way more so than me, and probably Troy. Now, when you look back at some of the experiences that you've been through, and you're familiar with this whole internal, external, I, we, it's, they sort of thing, can you think back of a time where you were running into a problem where it was truly just maybe one of the quadrants was out of balance, or maybe it was all collective and not individual? Any stories like that?
I feel like everyone is like that, to be honest with you. It's always, and that's part of the problem. It's always so imbalanced that you end up losing sight of how to be able to kind of move around all the quadrants, or at least, take a view of all the quadrants, because transformation means so many different things to organizations. And I love one of the quotes that one of the coaches I work with, she uses is, you can't rent an agile transformation. So, right, you can't. So, but with that being said, I see, and again, I appreciate actively being able to listen to this. And maybe, again, I'm thinking kind of simplistically, but to me, this is more of a tool that I would benefit from as a coach than necessarily I would utilize for an organization right away to adopt. Maybe I'm saying it doesn't matter who's using it. It's just a matter of, to me, this might be, and I'll be curious, Troy, since you've experimented with this, did you use this language? Was this the language you used when you were facilitating this as a facilitation framework, or as a thought process, right? Like, here's a way you can think about systems thinking and how do we get from concept to cash, for lack of a better term.
So usually no, but in this example, I did use it for this workshop I did to get the root cause of a lot of the, let's say, unhappiness or whatever the case is. So, or this workplace satisfaction. So I did use it. I kind of just explained what the 4 quadrants meant. And then I ran my integral retro as a way of getting ideas out. I also did other things like constellations and things like that. But it was really the integral retro that really drove out the most things from the group. And so I ran that, and then we did the hypothesis creation. And then basically I worked with that SVP after that, and he said, "How did you get all this stuff out of the people?" So I explained,
milk and cookies.
So I explained to him what integral theory was, and he was very interested in it. In fact, he ended up writing me like a letter of recommendation later, and that was one of the key things that he named in that letter was about integral theory. So he must have liked it. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's just, the reason I ask is because sometimes it's one of the challenges for me going in and talking about concepts that have this, I don't want to say abstract, but different vocabulary than what it means in the current culture of the organizations we parachute into. So right. I'm always curious to hear, like, when you use some of these more, I don't know, I think these are deeper, way more cerebral than just binary methods. And I don't know, I geek out over that, like thinking, well, gosh, I couldn't imagine articulating this as it's written to any C-suite. Like, I'd probably get, kicked out of there faster than
tossed
than you can say Agile.
But Troy, to Lef's point and to your example, right? So you just said you impacted a leader to a point where they wrote you a nice letter of recommendation that was actually in the letter. So that leader, he's the one who came up to you and said, "Hey," if I've understood your story correctly, he said, "Hey, where did you get all this? Like, where's it coming from?" Right? And then you turned around and started explaining it to him. So what you basically did, if I'm following correctly, is you created like a disciple, right? Where you explained to him, "Hey, look, here's where I'm getting this kooky idea from. Let me walk you through the mechanics." And then obviously it resonated. So maybe the secret to your point, Lef, about maybe not using the nomenclature, right? Because you'll blow people out of the water. Finding those people that are open-minded enough to give this a shot, and then start explaining the concept to them, and then see who bites. And I guarantee you, then they'll explain it to someone else and someone else and someone else, and then it grows and grows and grows. But
Yeah.
back to the initial to the thing we talked about with the four quadrants. And Troy, I think they talk about it in the book where, along with the holon concept, right, and everything being a part of everything else, and it's a whole, but it's a part of a greater and a smaller. Very often he brings back balance and how you need to have these pieces balanced. And one of the things that I noticed when I was applying this in my current role is when you try to change one quadrant, you may inadvertently knock everything else out of place. So it's a constant reassessment of consistently looking and getting things back to where they should be. So for example, Troy is a very influential leader, and he's the stick in the mud who's not really adopting this. Okay, so I finally get Troy to come around, and by the time Troy's come around and started to adopt this, well, maybe some of the behaviors have slipped, right? Or maybe the culture has soured a bit because I was busy educating Troy or working with coaching Troy to get him up to speed. So I think that's another thing to think about with this. And it's one of the warnings I think should come with, like on the outside of cigarettes or like claymores, front towards enemy and the back says do not eat. The instruction should be always look at the balance and make sure that you're addressing all four quadrants simultaneously, because it is the theory of everything.
Yeah, it's kind of the yin and the yang, if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. So I think, so Troy, I'm going to ask you a question. I think we might have covered this off, but it's on the agenda, so I wanted to ask. So say I'm a coach and I'm really, really stuck. I'm stuck somewhere, and I'm stuck in the cultural piece, or say I'm stuck in the system piece. What's the best way to get others to realize that when I look at our transformation holistically, this is where we need to spend our efforts to remove that constraint or unwind it. Because Leff talked about the nomenclature, right, where it can be a little heady. So what would you suggest to someone who after listening to this goes back and looks at their transformation and says, my problem is definitely in the system quadrant? How do they go about getting other people to understand that that's where the problem is?
Well, they may think that, but I would ask, what are we considering? What are we actively doing in all four right now? Like, how are we actively addressing all four quadrants? And if you can honestly say that only the fourth quadrant you're not addressing, then I would say, okay, that is likely the problem. But usually that's not the case. Usually you're only focused on one quadrant or maybe two at most, right? So I would say start with identifying what you could change, or what you could implement, or what you could start measuring in all four quadrants, and how might you talk to other people about it. You don't necessarily have to talk to them about it in this terms. You can say, hey, I think, for example, quadrant 4, right? It might be, again, those could be your systemic issues, right? So maybe it's the way your architecture is currently working to the point where you can't do continuous deployment because of some architectural thing. So that could lead in that, and that's more of a systemic issue, because maybe that's just beyond one team's scope to change that architecture, because it's going to impact so many other teams, right? So that is something that might lie in that fourth quadrant. And you can say, hey, you can use quadrant 3 to drive decision making in quadrant 4. So you can use something like track cycle time, lead time, and throughput for features through a program, for example. And then you can use a CFD to see where things are actually getting stuck, right, for that cycle time. And you could say, hey, why are they getting stuck here? It's probably not because of the team. It's probably because of a systemic issue. So what should we measure for the system? And then you could start talking about, well, maybe things wouldn't pile up in the waiting for release if we improved the way that we release, right? Our architecture, something like that. So you can use metrics from other quadrants to drive the conversations for the other quadrants, because like I said, they're all related if you think about it. So I'm a big fan of flow metrics. And in fact, those flow metrics can really help drive the right conversations for that quadrant 4, because once you can prove using flow metrics that the problem isn't really at the team level, it isn't with the team, it is a systemic issue, then you can really have those conversations. But if you just go to a leader and say problems with the system and not with the team, a lot of times that's not what people think, because they say, oh, well, the team could be more productive. Team could get higher velocity. The team could be doing this and that, right? They could be more predictable. And that might be true, maybe, but that might not be the reason why your cycle time and throughput and lead time is not as effective as it could be. Usually that's because things are getting stuck in queues and wait states because of some systemic reason. So that's an example of how you might use, and you could talk to that using flow metrics. I'm just using that as an example.
Right.
You can use
That's
the
a good
flow
one.
metrics and not mention at all about integral theory or anything, but just use stuff from quadrant 3 to drive decision-making and other metrics in quadrant 4, if that makes sense.
That's perfect. That's perfect. There's no way we're going to top that as a closer. So I want to end with that. So I'm going to go around real quick. Andrew, any final thoughts? Any final thoughts, shout outs, conference appearances, TV shows, reality TV shows, anything?
Hey, it's the coach with the most. No, I, as always, just find me on the Uprising or out on Twitter land at Lean Left. But no, this was awesome. I appreciate the two of you sharing this with me. So I'm better tonight than I was when I started. So.
That's very nice.
Yes, thank you. How about you, Troy?
I just want to say, Ken Wilber, if you're listening, come on the show.
Oh, you beat me to it.
We will have you on the show. I tried to get in contact with him. I can't figure it out. So if anyone knows how to contact Ken Wilber, we'd love to have him on the show. He's a brilliant dude. Obviously, he wrote all this stuff. So
yeah, we didn't even scrape the surface of where he goes in about religion and science, and how you can have good science with deep religion, and without either side of that, neither one of them works. And the consistencies between multiple religions and life cycles, and we didn't even scratch the surface of that one. Those of you that are interested, check out the book. It's wild.
And we didn't even get into how to integrate spiral dynamics on top of this, because in his model he does.
So, yeah, believe it or not, that's an episode coming up. I think as not to bury the lead, but in that episode that left throughout talking about when are we ready for a coach? When are we ready to transform? I planned on bringing forward some of the spiral dynamic stuff around the conditions for change and what needs to be satisfied, open, closed, arrested, all that stuff. I think that is very powerful, talking about when do we pull the trigger.
All right. Sounds good.
So I'll just wrap us up. So on behalf of our listeners, I want to thank you, Drew. I want to thank you, Troy, for taking your time tonight. On behalf of Drew, Troy, and myself, I want to thank all the listeners for tuning in. There will obviously be a thread about this podcast posted on the Coalition. So come in and join the conversation. We'll put a link to the Integral Retro post in the show notes. We'll put a link to the book itself. Highly recommended. You can find us on Discord. We have a Discord server which is actually heating up. We have a bunch of stickers and funny stuff coming out, and just to give you a heads up as to what episodes are coming, we have a lot more coming on the transformation space. We have a couple of guests lined up. I don't want to ruin it, but we have some surprise guests coming up. So once again, I want to thank everybody for listening, and this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.